Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm really excited to welcome you to this very special Halaqa. I've been waiting for it for a really long time, so I'm so happy we're finally talking about prayer and the meaning of prayer. But I wanted to just take this opportunity in my intro to just talk a little bit about a couple of questions that I got after the last Halaqa. So last time I told you about a TED Talk that I had watched, one of the top 5 of all time, called The Power of Vulnerability. And it had 37.5 million views last I checked, like a night or two ago. And so obviously people were really interested in the idea of human connectedness. And the speaker, Brené Brown, basically argued that vulnerability and worthiness and authenticity and things like this were sort of the key ingredient for human connectedness. And I was trying to point out in my talk sort of the differentiation between taking a kind of a non-religious secular approach versus a, come on, Assalamu alaikum, come on in. So I was trying to talk about the difference between sort of a non-religious approach of someone who can come in and say, these are the really important things, vulnerability and authenticity and, being your authentic self, versus a Muslim approach, which for me, it's a faulty equation if you don't have God as part of the mix. And so I was trying to say that, you need to have God and the divine, especially as a Muslim, to achieve these sorts of things as authenticity and worthiness. And so one of the questions, so I got 2 questions afterwards, and I wanted to take the opportunity here to answer them and kind of put a finer point on some of the things that I was trying to convey. So first question is, I've really taken it to heart to live life more vulnerably, with my heart on my sleeve, as you do, as our beloved prophet did. May I ask, what are some ways in which you do this without being afraid of being dominated over or taken advantage of, with all of the social power politics that play out in life? I find that many times when I do try to live life vulnerably, many people take it as a sign of weakness and treat me accordingly. And how do we find that middle ground between strength and vulnerability? So there are several points that I really wanted to make about this, because when you respond to someone else's talk, you're basically adopting their language and their terminology and their approach to answering this question. And obviously I had an issue with the way she talked about it without sort of referencing the divine. And I think words really matter, and language matters, especially nuance matters, especially when you're trying to convey things like authenticity and who you are. And I think you have to be really careful what you measure, because when you start measuring things like vulnerability or authenticity, you actually might kind of get strange outcomes. And I think that for Muslims, what is really important is when you think about like worthiness and vulnerability and authenticity, they're obviously very important factors, but they're byproducts of something bigger that I think we need to be concerned about as Muslims. And for me, that issue is dignity. So I think that is kind of the end result or the ultimate goal that we really need to be focused on. And so when we talk about like, well, what is dignity? So I start out first with Google. Google says, or the standard textbook definition of dignity is a state of being that is worthy of being honored or respected. And so that's fine, but when we talk about, okay, what is that state of being, and what are those sort of component parts that make up dignity? And so I started to kind of do my own little unscientific brainstorm, and we've been watching sort of superhero movies recently, and we play a lot of video games at home, so these kinds of things factor into my thought processes. So I wanted to try and come up with some really interesting sort of ways to think about dignity. And so I really think that for Muslims, our superpower is dignity. And let me sort of talk about why it is a superpower and how I kind of envision it. So I think we start out, with our soul, which is sort of like the essence of who we are. And I kind of imagine, okay, so God, we know from the Quran, is light upon light, and that we all individually have sort of like a little flame within us. So we have that beautiful light, that's the essence of our soul. And I think of dignity as kind of like the protective cover around that soul. And I was thinking about kind of like a Fabergé egg, like something that's beautiful and, very delicate and unique and very valuable. And, if you imagine that we each get our own Fabergé egg intact when we're born, And in that Fabergé egg is sort of all those beautiful divine qualities, like the, purity and love and light and truth and honesty and the love for justice. And it's like all those things that, like, if you try to think about when you're a kid and you're on the playground and someone treats you unfairly and you immediately are like, hey, that was unfair. You're bad. You treated me wrong. It's kind of those really, like, qualities that you're born with, that, what we say in Islam is fitra, or, intuitive knowing. But beyond that, it's sort of like, like if I were to say, where does it reside in your body, like the whole idea of dignity? I would say somewhere in your heart and your stomach, because that's kind of where you feel it. And it's that feeling of, wanting to be loved and wanting to love. It's a feeling of that wants to be safe and protected, but wants to also reach out and connect to the world. And it's the part that, where you get strength and you feel like you love justice and you love beauty. So, all of these things, we start out with them at birth. And I think over time, through our life experiences, oftentimes that Fabergé egg comes and someone like cracks it, hits it with something, and it hurts because your dignity gets hurt and your dignity can be compromised. So that, it's like when dignity, when something goes wrong, it's like that whole protective cover over your divine light is compromised. And it can really change the way you understand and you engage with people. So to kind of put like a painful example with that, I shared like in one of the previous halakas when we were talking about, Kavanaugh and how upset I was, and we were all kind of, upset about the Me Too movement and the experience that sexual abuse survivors go through. And I shared that I was a survivor of sexual abuse. And there is nothing that is more decimating for dignity than trauma and abuse. And so, this was one of the things that, as I had said before, it was something that happened to me when I was very young, and so I didn't become actually aware of it until I was much older, and actually after I converted. And what was interesting is after the professor and I got married, a lot of these sorts of damages to my Fabergé egg came to light. And it was, I remember like a story, for example, where I was at my 10-year high school reunion. I had already converted to Islam. I had been Islam for almost a year, and this was actually before I knew the professor. And I remember I was leaving, and one of my classmates greeted me. And it was not someone that I was friends with, really. I mean, I just sort of knew him. And we started talking and chatting. And before we left, for some reason, he asked me, can I please have a hug? And it was really odd because, I didn't have any connection with him. But inside of me, I was like screaming, no, you can't have a hug. I don't like you. I don't even know you. Why are you asking? I don't want to touch you or whatever. But I complied and I gave him a hug. And it was, and going back and looking at that, it hurt my dignity. I felt really, actually, after I hugged him, I felt very compromised. And I felt very, like, violated, and I learned later on that this is kind of what happens when, especially for, victims of abuse survivors, is oftentimes you don't really know how to say no, you don't know how to set boundaries, you don't, that feeling of being protected has been compromised. And many years later, when I actually started to address that, this was something that was really important in my healing. Like the professor, I sometimes tell this story where, before Islam, I was very much a broken human being where I couldn't even say no for the simplest types of things. Like if somebody asked me to do anything, I would feel obligated and I would have to do that. I couldn't set boundaries and I couldn't say, no, I don't want to do this. And I think that that is an indication of, dignity compromised. And part of me actually finding myself again and rebuilding my dignity and figuring out who I was actually recognizing these kinds of things and rebuilding, and the beautiful things that Islam sort of calls you to do in terms of building that dignity were part of the things that were able to heal me. So what are some of these component parts? Like what are some of these things that, if I go back to my Fabergé egg, would actually, if someone has broken your Fabergé egg, would actually heal it and try and strengthen it? And the first thing is one of the things we talked about last time, which is knowing yourself and going through the process of you know, understanding like what is your God-given gift, what is your purpose, you know, what are your strengths, your weaknesses, your moral character, and you know, all of those things help you to figure out who you are and also who your God is. And then things like that can help you find your self-worth, your self-respect, and start building sort of your sense of empathy towards others and being able to love others, love yourself, and kind of be able to give outright. So if you are injured, like your Fabergé egg has been damaged, you spend all of your energy kind of trying to fix that, and you can't really get beyond your own damage to actually, you know, sharing sort of your light with the rest of the world. So it's a really important part. So when we talk about dignity again, it's like, you know, all of those other things like vulnerability and authenticity and all those things will fall into place if dignity is intact. And the things that you can do to, like, so, you know, back to my video game example. So I imagine that you have your shell that's covering your light, and if you're able to kind of take those component parts and really strengthen them, then it's like you can activate that egg, and you can turn that egg into sort of a magic lantern that starts shining like really bright light. And you know, you know, it's like, you know, part of always remembering, you know, why we're here, I think, is sharing that light of your soul with others. And if you never get to that point, you've really lost, you know, an opportunity to connect with others. But that actually, okay, so how do you, let's say you've gotten to your magic lantern and you're able to kind of share your light with others. It's really important to also think about, how do I make that lantern shine really bright? Because if you feed it and you have strong dignity, things are good and you shine, and other people read it, they see it, they feel it. But if your dignity is low and you don't feel, you know, comfortable in yourself, you can't reach out to other people. So that leads me to kind of the second question that was sent to me, which is, how do you actually feed that divine light? So the second question is, what are some of the other ways that we can live a life of creating goodness? I'm always inspired by the small things you say you do, for example, putting stray shopping carts back or trying to make people smile. And I've always read about creating goodness, or ihsan, in the abstract, but I'm never sure how to start on the path towards it or how to implement it in my life. For someone like me who lacks imagination, how can I self-cultivate ihsan in concrete ways, especially in ordinary day-to-day life? I'll treasure even the smallest suggestion and advice, so please don't hold back. So, you know, so the idea is, how do we create goodness and how do we feed that divine light in us? And, you know, I think that there are three really component parts to kind of creating goodness and starting to feed that light. And one is sort of breaking out of your own personal inertia. Secondly is increasing your sense of empathy. And third is sort of creating a habit. So I told you before I was an only child, and I had one surefire way when I was growing up, making sure that anything could get done. And that pretty much consisted of calling my mom. So like, Mom, can you please come do this? Mom, can you come do that for me? And what that meant is that I could sit on my couch and sit in my inertia, because someone else could always do something for me. And I think that's a part of the process of, you know, breaking out of that and being able to be active in creating goodness, is recognizing that you have a lot of things that kind of hold you back and, you know, keep you in that inertia. So whether it's fear, whether it's embarrassment, whether it's just laziness, or just kind of the feeling of, you know, I really just don't feel like doing this, or someone else can do it. I think that that's something that's sort of part of all of us from the time we are young, and something that we have to grow out of. So life begins to, you know, life experiences can try to alter that, but breaking out of your inertia is something that can either be sort of gentle through life, like you start caring about other people, you start caring about your friends, or maybe you have a pet, or you marry someone and you have kids, and you're sort of forced to, you know, like care about someone else other than yourself. Or God could possibly give you a test that kind of breaks you out of your inertia. So, you know, for example, you know, I look back on some of, you know, our difficult experiences. Another painful thing that developed my empathy and also my breaking through that inertia is I remember when the professor was very ill, and you're sort of forced in a situation to start always thinking in terms of like getting up and doing something for someone else. And in Islam it's really beautiful. We have a tradition of service, and it's like it's so much a part of who we are as Muslims. You recognize that service is kind of a way to get up out of yourself and help someone else. And it's like the more you do it, the better you get at it, and it develops your empathy, and it develops your kind of knee-jerk, reaction to be able to get up and do something for someone else. And prayer, I think, is something also that is beautiful by design, because it sort of forces you to get up and out of your inertia 5 times a day, and just even the getting up out of your chair to do something activates you in a way that's very different. When the professor was really ill, I was like oftentimes the primary caregiver, and forced to be like empathetic towards the needs of someone, like not just someone who's ill and needed to be taken care of. So everything from basic things like driving or feeding or whatever, those are like kind of straightforward, or giving medicine. But the things that are harder is like thinking about what does this person need sort of emotionally and spiritually, or emotionally, or what will make this person happy. And it like forces you to like really experience life through someone else's eyes. And like things like illness are, I believe, like a test from God that can push you to develop empathy in a way you might never have done so before. And then other than that, building the habit of like creating goodness starts by really small things. So last time I talked about how I enjoy sort of creating a smile or interacting with people. I think that if you can just even say something nice to someone, or tell someone how much you appreciate them, these little things are really important in kind of just getting that habit started. I had a couple of examples that there was one time where I just wanted to share like sort of 2 last stories with you. I was shopping at Costco, and I was in the dog section, of course, buying dog bones. And I got to this part where it's like there's these 2 last packages of bully sticks. If you know what these are, they're like really expensive, and if you have dogs, you need these kinds of things. So I happened to see that there were 2 packages left, and I kind of grabbed them. And as I was leaving, an older couple came up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, where did you get those? I've been looking for them." And so I looked at her, and I was like, "Oh, well, here, I'll give you one of mine." And she was like, no, it's okay, it's okay. I'm like, no, really, if you need one, I'm happy to give it to you. And I was thinking to myself, I know how difficult it is when you need these kinds of things and you don't have them. And so I was like, no, really, it's fine. And so she took it, and they were like, oh my God, they're so kind, and thank you so much. And like, I think back to sort of my previous life where it was like, okay, when in my inertial state, I would have been like, too bad, snooze you lose, last 2 I got, and it's like, or I might have been like, after they walked away, I might have thought to myself, shoot, I probably should have given them one of these packages, and it could have made a difference. And then, like, how many times have we been in a situation where you see something and you're like, man, somebody should do that. Someone should, I should have, and then the opportunity passes and you're like, oh, okay, I should have done that. That's that inertia that I'm talking about. So I gave her the package. She was really happy. 5 minutes later, I saw her like in another section of Costco. And she goes, oh my God, there you are. She grabbed my arm and she was on the phone. She's like, I'm calling my daughter to tell her how kind you are. And, and so it made me feel so good inside, because it's like, you made someone so happy, and every time that woman takes one of those bones out of that package, she's going to think about me, And so you spread goodness in that way. And a lot of that is, again, like just building that habit of not sitting back and going, okay, someone should do this. Or, it would be really nice if, I should have done that. but to kind of transform your thinking into, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be the one that is the first to jump up and help. The second story is, I'm taking you along my daily routes of all the errands I run. So I went to CVS to pick up some medicine, and I was in the parking lot, and there was this old man, really old man, like he was with his cane, and he was like, you know, in his 90s or something. And I'm always sort of sad when I see old people by themselves without a caregiver, and he was obviously at CVS trying to get his medicine. So he was climbing into his car, and as he was doing that, another car came very quickly and drove and parked right next to him, and it was like very close and very fast. And I think for a 90-year-old man, even if, you know, I mean, I didn't see what happened, but, you know, he was obviously scared. So the guy who came out of the car said, the old man said to the guy, "Excuse me, sir, you almost hit me." And the guy, like, didn't even look at the old man and said, "Not even close, not even close," and kind of like ran into CVS. And I saw this, and it broke my heart. So I like stood there, and I, you know, was like, oh my God, why was this guy such a jerk? So I'm like, okay, you know what, I'm going to go up to that old man, and I'm just going to talk to him. So I went up to him, and I'm like, you know, are you okay? You know, I'm really sorry that that happened. And he was like, yeah, you know, that man, he almost ran me over. He almost hit me. And, you know, he just had a chance to, like, express, like, how he felt, because he was completely alone. So, you know, I was like, okay, well, I'm really sorry, and I hope you're okay. And I took the time to talk to him a little bit. And then he was happy, and it made me feel really good, like he wasn't, you know, alone anymore. And he recognized that someone saw his pain. So, you know, these are the kinds of things, like, you know, I think that when we talk, you know, going back to sort of like, you know, the original talk about human connectedness being a function of vulnerability or authenticity or whatever, you know, these are all really nice things in the abstract. But I think what really actually makes a difference, and what kind of, you know, increases your dignity and shines your light towards others and creates human connectedness, is when you actually interact with other people, and you take the time, you smile, you talk to them, you ask them what is their name, you have a conversation, you tell them a joke, you know, you care, and you have to start noticing, you know, to do this, you have to increase your empathy, because you look around you and you see, like, who is around that I can actually, you know, give a gift of light towards. And I think that's how you can make human connectedness. So it's not a question of strength, balancing strength versus vulnerability. It's about, you know, like using your superpower of dignity, building that light so that you can get beyond yourself, get beyond your inertia, see what light you can spread to others, and build that human connectedness towards others. So, for what that's worth, I have some stories. So, thank you.
Inshallah, today we talk about Salah. Again, I've had a long-standing requests, people that have asked me to talk about Salah, and we're opening up a subject that we could spend hours upon hours talking about. And it is also a topic that is very close to my heart, and the closer something is to you, the harder it is to talk about. Let's start with the fact that there are many Muslims who don't do their salah, they don't pray 5 times a day. And there are many Muslims that do pray 5 times a day, but they're not sure what praying 5 times a day is about. or what it actually means. And both are deeply problematic. The Prophet ﷺ, in numerous hadiths that reach the point of tawatur, reach the point of being cumulatively transmitted, so we get to the point of beyond a shadow of doubt as to authenticity, has underscored time and time again that as-salah imaduddin, that salah is the backbone of Islam, and that man tarakaha faqad hadama ad-din, that if you don't uphold the salah, then you effectively have destroyed the backbone of the religion. In other transmissions, the Prophet ﷺ have said, "Muftahu al-Jannah as-salah," the key to the hereafter is salah, and salah is the backbone, and as we will explain, it's a backbone and the heart, the pulse of your relationship with Allah and the pulse of Islam. To me, a Muslim that doesn't pray 5 times a day, whether they know what they're doing or not, they're effectively emptying Islam of its heart and soul. And whether they remain a Muslim or not, I leave it up to Allah. It's something that God will judge. But for me, they become an alien in terms of my feeling about their Islamicity. It's such a contradiction in terms of a Muslim that does not perform their salah, that does not keep up their prayer. Now, of course, a Muslim that does keep up the prayer but doesn't exactly know what it's about is in better shape. There's no doubt. At least they are keeping the venue open. But as Muhammad Iqbal once said, and this is critical for understanding the role and purpose of salah. Muhammad Iqbal once said that the posture of the body determines the attitude of the mind. The posture of the body determines the attitude of the mind. What you do physically with your body has a direct impact on your intellectual attitudes and your perception of reality. It is a myth that you can perceive reality in ways that are unaffected by your physicality. Remember that Islam, the core of the Islamic message, is belief and practice. That practice alone is insufficient and belief alone is insufficient. It is the balance, the complementary dynamic between belief and practice. And salah is the physical display, and I like what Grace said about breaking the inertia. It's interestingly a very nice way of putting it, that it is a forcing the body to depart from our natural condition of inertia. And in terms, what you do with this body affects your intellectual and your spiritual attitude. But a step beyond that, you must understand that in the modern age, we have ways of measuring energy and ways of measuring magnetic fields and the like. But even before we adopted our modern tools for evaluating the way that what we do physically affects the unperceived, the unseen, of the world. The magnetic field is unseen. Energy is unseen. But we can measure its effect, we can experience its effect. The world of unseen is as present as the world of the seen. I mean, we know now that actually most of space is occupied by the unseen. Most of space is occupied by black matter and dark matter, and it's not just unseen, but it even exercises very weak effects on magnetic fields, and so for the most part, we don't even know much about it. So the world of the unseen is very much as present in your life as the world of the seen. Now, this is very important to remember in Salah, because Salah not only has an impact on your spiritual and physical and mental attitude, not only, as Iqbal says, that the posture of the body determines the attitude of the mind, but it even has an impact on the space around you. Salah is a direct manipulation of space. So I can enter a house, and if you develop these abilities, or God has given them to you naturally, you get to a point where you can enter a house and you can immediately tell whether Salah is performed in this house or not, just by the perception of energy in that space. A room that is prayed in has a very different energy than a room that is not prayed in. We physically can manipulate space and energy, and our physicality affects space and energy. There are areas that you enter that immediately, innately, subconsciously you perceive as evil. You get an uneasy feeling and you're not sure why. You feel you're in an evil space and you want to leave. And there are areas that you enter in which that fills you with repose and with peace and tranquility. All of us have had these experiences. But we are very good, as Grace pointed out, that we're very good at overcoming our initial reactions and convincing ourselves to deny that inner voice inside of us, that innate fitra that God puts in us, that innate intuition that is in us, that informs us about the nature of space and the nature of energies that surround us, the auras. I'll tell you, and that's why I kept delaying talking about Salah for so long, because the way I talk about it among contemporary Muslims, unfortunately, is not what has become common. But Salah affects even the aura that surrounds you as a human being. How or whether you perform Salah has a direct effect on your aura as a human being. And a person that can perceive this aura, or if you want to get fancy and technological, if you get one of these cameras that is capable of capturing a human aura, you can see it. If you develop the abilities, you don't need a camera to see it. But I can tell you that the aura of a human being that prays is very different than the aura of a human being that does not pray. And the extent and how you do your prayer affects your aura in very direct and unmitigated and ways that are not arguable. We only argue about things because we're ignorant, because we don't see them. And we live in a world of causality, physical causality, but the causality that we are aware of is only a small percentage of the reality that surrounds us. I'll give you another example. There are certain areas, certain spaces in which you look at the history and you see that there has, in this space, a lot of violence has been committed. Repeated history of assaults. And you wonder, why is it that so many evil things happened in the space? The answer is because there is evil space, and there is good space, there is clean space, and there is tranquil space, and there is demonic space, and there is angelic space. You, as a human being, what you do, you affect that space, and you shape that space. And you leave an imprint on it as real and as true as the fingerprint that a human being leaves on a physical material. And so when a human being commits an evil act in a certain amount of space, they affect that space in a way that could affect the consciousness of other human beings that come to the same space later. And that is why people who are susceptible can enter a space and can be influenced by it to commit an evil act. It is possible that if it hadn't been for the fact that a certain person lived in a certain area or a certain space, they would not have committed that murder. In other words, the space itself exercises, it doesn't take away their free will, it doesn't take away their volition, but it influences them in ways that are unmistakable and undeniable. So first you have to accept that. It's the same way that Iman bil Ghaib, that believing in the unseen, is an article of faith. Believing that prayer is a direct manipulation of space must be an article of Iman as well. Because otherwise, you are missing a very important part of the entire dynamic and the entire process. Now, the second thing, the second critical point is that Salah is a process that begins with purification, what we normally call wudu or tahara, depending on the case, with purification, in which you enter into a psychological state that passes on to iqama, where you are standing before your Maker, your Lord, your God, and that culminates in sujood or in prostration. Purification, iqama, standing before God, and that culminates in prostration, in sujood. فَخَرُّوا لِلَّهِ سُجَّدًا. That ultimately the climax of the act is not the taslim, is not when we say at the end of prayer, Assalamu alaikum, but the culmination of the salah is the act of prostration. Now, as Muslims, we are informed and we believe, both, informed and we believe, that as-sujud lillah, the prostrating before Allah, is not just the established sunnah, the established practice of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but it was also the established practice of the Abrahamic prophets going all back to the Prophet Ibrahim. That the act of prostrating, and we'll talk about exactly why and all of that, but you have to go with me step by step. The posture of prostration before the Lord, as-sujud lillah, is a message and a mission. It is a covenant unto creation. And it is not only a covenant unto creation from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ, Abraham, but remember the very, very primordial narrative of creation itself. At the point of creation, the angels prostrate before the Lord. At the point of creation, the angels prostrate before the Lord. The angels don't have free will, and when they're told to prostrate, they prostrate. But we are told, Allah informs us in the Quran, that everything in creation, in the entire creation, are in state of supplication and sujood and prostration before the Lord. Now, entire creation does not have free will, and their prostration is in ways that we don't comprehend, but they are in a state of constant sujood before the Lord. Who does have free will? Human beings and jinn. When jinn was commanded to prostrate before human beings because of the legacy of the covenant, which we will talk about in a second, the act of rebellion symbolized by Satan was to refuse to prostrate. Now, what is the act of rebellion? Before we talked about one aspect of it, the aspect of racism or supremacism. But more importantly, it was the elevation of the ego above the will of the Lord. The act of prostration is an act of humility. It's an act of humility. It's an admission of the duty of humility before the Creator. Now, in upholding that principle, there are many implications, numerous implications. And that is why the Prophet ﷺ teaches us أقرب ما يكون العبد لربه أن يكون ساجدا, that, and in another narrative of hadith, أقرب ما يكون العبد لله أن يكون ساجدا. There comes in many variants, but it's the same message. That the closest a human being is to the Lord is when a human being is prostrating. When you are in prostration, you are at the point where you are closest to the Lord, because you are admitting, you're surrendering your humility, your arrogance, and admitting, opening your heart to humility before the Lord. And it is in the act of sujood. It reminds me when Malcolm X converted to Islam, and if you know something about Malcolm X, he used to be a very bad character. He used to describe himself as Satan possessed, because he was a pimp and abused women and so on. And when he converts to Islam, the hardest thing he had to learn was to prostrate. And he has a very wonderful description when he goes to Mecca and he wants to learn how to do sujood. And he speaks wonderfully about what it meant to melt away his human arrogance before God, and the sense of dignity that he learns through this act of prostration. Because when you prostrate before the Lord, you are reclaiming your dignity before entire creation. And so when Grace says that the core of a human being is dignity, she's absolutely right. But we reclaim our dignity. At the same time, we admit our humility before our Creator. So it is not, dignity doesn't become a state of self-involved, self-righteous arrogance. Okay. So it is critical to remember that you are partaking in something that from the moment of creation, this act of prostration, because our prayer as Muslims but re-invokes this entire narrative of the primordial nature of prostration before the Lord, as primordial as the Lord's will. The Lord's will has no beginning and no end, and the duty to prostrate before the Lord is primordial as well. It has no beginning and no end. Okay. So let's take it then step by step. Now remember that Allah, when it describes the nature of true belief, in the Quran it says خَرُّوا سُجَّدًا وَهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ, that those who are swift to prostrate before the Lord and they are not arrogant. The kibar, the istikbar, arrogance, is in direct contradiction to sujood, to prostration. When you are in prayer, you are going to stand before God and nothing less. Hamid al-Ghazali in his Ihya emphasizes this point, and in fact, even if among the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that in prayer you are accessing God directly without mediators. You are doing no less than standing before God. And what you visualize is that you are standing before God. And we are promised repeatedly in the Quran and in the Hadith, repeatedly, that in fact you have an audience with no less than God. We start this prayer from the point of ablutions, al-wudu. وَجَعَلْنَا مِنْ مَاءٍ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ, that Allah has created life from water. And when you are readying yourself to stand before the Lord, you re-invoke the beauty of life, the spark of life, the energy of life by doing the ablutions. The Quran instructs us or refers to washing the hands and the face and so on, but we know the form of wudu from the Prophet ﷺ. I'm going to pass over all the juristic debates about what, and we'll sum it up, that you go to the substance from which Allah created life, water, and you use that for tuhur, for cleansing. And you symbolically enter, it's as if you are preparing to stand before the majesty. And in a symbolic act of cleansing, where you wash the hands, the face, and from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we know that you wash the mouth, the nose, and you symbolically pass water over your head, you wash your feet. Washing the feet, by the way, is again anchored in the Abrahamic tradition. From Jesus, Moses, to Abraham, washing the feet as a symbol of rekindling the covenant with God is anchored in the Abrahamic tradition. And so when we Muslims wash our feet, some Muslims are embarrassed to wash their feet in public. You're performing an act of the covenant. The idea is not to have stinky feet, because you should wash and avoid stinky feet anyway. But the idea is that re-invoking the covenant of life, the very creation of the moment of creation of life. Then you get ready, and again I am summarizing for the interest of time a great deal of hadith, traditions, sunnah, from the Prophet, from the companions, from the Ahlul Bayt, from the family of the Prophet. You make sure that you stand in a clean space. Now, there's a lot in the traditions about the desirability of, if you not praying Jama'ah, and Jama'ah is always a praiseworthy act, that you pray in, but let's sidestep that for the time being. But there's a lot about praying in a space to the extent possible without distractions, because you will stand before your Lord, and you will perform an act which is steeped in symbolism and steeped in the physical effect it will have upon the energies that surround you and that constitute you as a human being. So the beginning, the point where we symbolically and in actuality put ourselves in the presence of the Lord, is when we raise the hand and we say Allahu Akbar. At that moment, the prayer has started, and it starts with the posture in a state of qiyam. You are standing up. Now, you are standing up as you will stand before your Lord in the hereafter, and that's why we start the prayer standing up. We are invoking the inevitability of our stand in the hereafter, all to be judged before the Lord. So you are putting yourself at that point. There's a lot in the literature, and teachers, when they teach students to do their proper salah, that as you prepare yourself for standing before the Lord, to think, before you say the Allahu Akbar, to think of your accountability and your report card. What have you done and what you have not done? Because you're going to stand in that way in the hereafter. Now, I will pass through the forms and then I will talk about the substance of what we say, because there's a lot about to say to talk about in prayer. Because remember that it's not just that we do physical acts, but we recite certain things, and what we recite is as important as the physical act. There's a lot. You could give hours and hours, and if we were doing it right, we would actually practice it together. So we start in that posture of standing up, as we will stand up before God in the hereafter. Now, we recite the Fatiha, a short surah, and we'll talk about these, we'll come back to them. Why do we recite the Fatiha? Why do we recite a short surah? At that point, just remember that the sajda is a primordial and ultimate act, the prostration before God. Before we do that, before we head to the prostration, to the act of sujood, we acknowledge in the same way that in the hereafter, those who are pious acknowledge the majesty that they stand before with an act of what some have called tahiyya. Tahiyya is like a salute. What is your salute to the Lord that precedes prostration? It's ruku'. You bend before God. It's when you say Subhana Rabbiyal Azim, Subhana Rabbiyal Azim 3 times, you are saluting the majesty in this act of ruku'. Before you head to the act of prostration, the sajda, in the same way that what precedes the ultimate act is life, you rise up again and you declare a principle, an affirmation of a principle. Sama Allahu liman hamida. Allah hears that who acknowledges their gratitude to Allah. And that's why we say, wa rabbana wa lakal hamd. So, but before we head to the sajda, we rise up again, and there's a lot of people talked about why we rise up again and why we don't do ruku' and just do sujood immediately. And to sum up a great deal of, there's some things I will tell you later, that it is the acknowledgement that we go from life, the qiyam of life, the stand of life, to death and the hereafter in the prostration. And that is why sajda al-ula, the first prostration, is a prostration in acknowledgement to hayatul ard, the life on earth. And the sajda thaniya, the second sajda, is an acknowledgement of a prostration before the Lord in the hereafter. So, and interestingly, even in the dynamics of the Quran and the dynamics of everything that Allah has revealed to us, we constantly affirm a duality between life and death, death and the hereafter, hellfire and Jannah, heaven. There is this constant duality, and even in prayer, we affirm this duality. So every time we do ruku', there is a qiyam, and every time there is a sujood, there is a qiyam. It is as if we are. Some have elaborated and said it is also an acknowledgement that even if we prostrate before the Lord, we cannot remain in prostration forever, because our nature is we're not angels. The minute we prostrate, we start being pulled the other direction, and that is to stand up again. So the first, when we say God hears that who is grateful, God hears that who is thankful, Sama Allahu liman hamida, and we answer that by Rabbana wa lakal hamd, and we affirm our gratitude to Allah, then we are ready, after that affirmation, to go before our Lord in prostration. Now, there are many narratives that, I mean, how authentic they are, we can debate that, about that this is precisely what took place before God and the angels, when the angels prostrated before the Lord, when they went from an initial acknowledgement of the presence of the Lord through ruku'ah, through bowing down, and then from standing up, everyone was told to do sujood, and that we are affirming or repeating that same symbolic set of acts. You know, that is a different matter. But, so the first sajda is the sajda in which we acknowledge that our relationship to Allah, in prostrating before our Lord, we surrender our pride and our ego in an absolute act of humility. In the first sajda, it is a prostration symbolically for life on earth. Then we rise up in a short break, and in that short break, we are supposed to, although many Muslims don't take advantage of that, we are supposed to relax for a second and utter dua, utter supplications. So, Allahumma ighfir li wa li waliday, Allahumma ighfir li warhamni, Allahumma afu anni warhamni waghfir li. That from the first prostration, we rise up in the short break and we utter a supplication to our Lord before we take the second prostration, the second sajda, and that second sajda is symbolically a prostration for the hereafter. Now, it is critical throughout the prayer that you keep in mind that in fact what you are symbolically performing is precisely that. You are standing before the Lord as you will stand in the hereafter. You are saluting the Lord in the ruku'ah. You are standing up to catch your breath and breathe deeply and let the air enter into, feel the air into your entire body before you go down in prostration, acknowledging your relationship to the Lord on this earth, and then a short break for dua, and then the second prostration, acknowledging your relationship before the Lord in the hereafter. Okay. An important point, and one of the things that you can read some fascinating material on, is that we perform cycles, rak'ah, what we call a rak'ah. A rak'ah is a complete cycle from the qiyam to the ruku'ah to the sujood. In the qiyam to the ruku'ah to the sujood, we assume the postures that a human being, think of breaking, as Grace called it, breaking the inertia, which is actually nicely fits. You are assuming all the postures that a human being can take, except for one, and that's laying flat. And that's a posture you will assume in death. So you're assuming all the postures of life, standing up, bending, and posturing. In the sajda, many have commented and spoken at length about the similarity between the sajda and what they call the primordial position of the fetus. That all creations, all things created, start out in this, in effectively a sajda but flipped, which is again of remarkable symbolic power. In the cycles that we perform, two critical points. Well, actually, before we get to these, one critical point. And that is the concept of divine time. Divine time. The cycles of the fara'id total 17 rak'ahs. Ibn Sab'in what's the name of the book? I'm trying to remember the name of a book that I want to read. Actually, yeah, that's fine. It's Jabir ibn Hayyan. Jabir ibn Hayyan, he wrote a book called Kitab al-Sab'in. Another book that you can read also on this is Kitab al-Hamza. Jabir ibn Hayyan wrote a book called Kitab al-Sab'in, in which he works out the mathematical equation of the key to the equation of life, the balance, the equation of mizan, of the balance. What do you call that? It's not that equation, but it predates it. Yeah, it goes 1, 3, 5, 8. Anyway,
prime numbers?
no. It's the equation of in mosaic art there are 17 shapes. The sum total of what mosaic art will produce are 17 shapes. These 17 shapes are the 17 possible shapes of entire design of everything in existence. Jabir ibn Hayyan in Kitab al-Sab'in has this long discussion. Even if you can actually do it, even if you have a computer and you Google the number 17, you will find long entries about the mysteries of the number 17. And that the number 17 is supposed to stand, numerology is very interesting. The number 17 is supposed to stand for justice, wisdom, balance, divinity, and that's not just in Islam, that's even predates Islam, by the way. So it is not an accident that we perform 17 rak'ahs. Now, divine time, which starts out with the 2 rak'ahs of Fajr, 4 rak'ahs of Dhuhr, 4 rak'ahs of Asr, 3 rak'ahs of Maghrib, and 4 rak'ahs of Isha, forces you, in the midst of submitting to temporal secular time, forces you to continue being aware. And what is fascinating to me is that people who wrote in the medieval age, before the invention of electricity, like, that's why I mentioned Ibn Sab'in, the famous Sufi, the Andalusi. Ibn Sab'in says there will come a time where human beings will master the division of time on earth, he didn't say electricity, but he said they will master the way that they will manipulate the hour so that it would no longer comport to divine time, from the sunrise to sundown. And that prayer will be the link that a human being has to the time of nature and the time of creation. So in other words, it's what forces you to still be conscious of sunrise and sundown. And that, in fact, while secular time will, and by the way, this contradiction, the irony of this contradiction, exists in present-day Mecca, and I'm sure if Ibn Sab'in would have saw it, he would have passed out. Because in present-day Mecca, while you have prayer done at Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, right? So people start coming into the mosque at Fajr. After Isha, people start leaving the mosque. But hanging above the Kaaba, looming above the Kaaba, is this Big Ben clock that doesn't follow divine time, it follows secular time. And the paradox between the two is amazing. I mean, it truly makes you reflect on the entire modern condition. But in prayer itself, it is critical that you remind yourself and to try to, as much as possible, because in doing that, you will be closer to Allah. And in doing that, you will affect the energies around you to keep divine time rather than to make your prayers submit to secular time. So in other words, some people will not rise for Fajr, and they will always just pray the 2 rak'ahs of Subh with Dhuhr. Or some people will miss prayer and then bunch everything at the end. It is critical that God is calling upon you. That's the time of nature. That's the time of creation. That's the time from sunrise to sundown. And that it is critical that you struggle to maintain that time conscious inside of you and to perform your prayers within these times, because at least 3 main times that are mentioned in the Quran. 3 main times. Sunrise, midday, and sundown. And these 3 main times at the heart and pulse of the divine time. Now, of course, there's, whether divine time breaks into 5 or mainly 3 is a long debate we don't need to get into. Okay. Now, Salah is mentioned for those Muslims who believe that they can be good Muslims without prayer. The irony is that Salah is mentioned more than anything else in the Quran except for Shahada. Allah could not have reminded human beings of the importance of prayer more than Allah did. You can't open a page of the Quran without Allah reminding you, do your prayers. Aqim salata li dhikri. Right? Every time prayer is mentioned, it is also mentioned, it is co-joined with either zakah, giving alms, because prayer, if your prayer, as the Prophet ﷺ said, if your prayer doesn't teach you to abstain from doing bad and from making you open your heart to what is good, then you've gained nothing from your prayer. And that's what that's what we're coming to. Prayer is a dynamic, not just with Allah, but with entire creation. Salah is not just you standing and prostrating before your Lord, but it radiates, as Ibn Arabi said, it radiates from that act, from that cycles of 17 to an act of goodness upon the entire creation, leave alone humanity. So it is always co-mentioned with giving alms. So what is the best good you can give? You can do is to give, to give, to give without limits. Give material wealth, give kindness, give smiles, give goodness in every form. And it is also co-mentioned with أقم الصلاة وأمر بالمعروف وانهى عن المنكر, and enjoin what is good and discourage what is bad. Now in Wasiyyat Luqman, the Prophet Luqman والسلام, when he is giving his teachings to his son, tells him وأقم الصلاة وأمر بالمعروف وانهى عن المنكر واصبر على ما أصابك. The act of prayer itself, prostration before your Lord, igniting the love of goodness in your heart, and teaching you the ultimate act of sabr, perseverance before hardships. What prayer does is, in its very cyclical nature, the reason we in constantly keeping you attached to divine time and rekindling the majesty and the absoluteness of the Lord, is also give you the stance to persevere before all the hardships that befall you. And that is why the first thing the shaitan does when hardships start raining down on your head is to try to discourage you from praying. Because once you stop praying, you've also lost your lifeline to perseverance. And I assure you, you are no longer persevering before hardships, you are deteriorating and becoming corrupted with hardships. Prayer can maintain the integrity of your being before hardships. But once you let go of your prayer, and that is what people always do, hardship starts falling on them, they start feeling like, why should I pray? And once they abandon prayer, they start the process of eroding. And their aura erodes, their energy erodes, and what they end up with before they know it is a state of inertia, and inertia that leads to death. Because prayer is the very act of life. The very standing up and the ruku' and the sujood is affirmation of the energy of life. And here the point, critical point, the affirmation of the energy of resistance. And this is something that modern Muslims sadly forget, because their Wahhabi Islam and their Ikhbari Islam no longer reminds them of this. The nature of the act of resistance to erosion, to death, to godlessness, and to jabarut, to despotism, to tughyan, to injustice. Our resistance to that is affirmed in the act of prayer and prostration. When you prostrate before your Lord, you are also affirming at the same instant, I prostrate before no one else. And that is why Malcolm X says, when I learn to prostrate, I learn to resist. He also says something really interesting. He said, I learned not to fear death. When he learned to stand before his Lord in prayer. What is there to fear? This is remember this. Nabiullah, the Prophet of God, Moses, stood and prostrated in an act of resistance to the people of Pharaoh, to the people of Pharaoh, right? The Prophet of God, Salih, alayhi salatu wasalam, prostrated before the Lord in an act of resistance to the people of Thamud. Right? The Prophet of Allah, والسلام, Hud, prostrated before the Lord in an act of resistance to the people of Ad. The Prophet of Allah, والسلام, Shu'aib, stood in an act of qiyam and prostrated before the Lord in an act of resistance to the people of Madian. The prophets of Allah, Dawood, David, and Isa, Jesus, stood and prostrated before the Lord in an act of resistance to the oppressors of the Israelites, the Romans. And Muhammad, the Prophet of the Lord, ﷺ, stood and prostrated to the Lord in an act of resistance to the people of Quraysh. The entire narrative of the prophets is to stand before the Lord and to prostrate before the Lord, not simply, and that's the end of the story, but to resist an injustice by an unjust people. That is the story of all the prophets. It's a rebellion against oppression. When we Muslims, when you stand before the Lord, you take account of what's to your credit and what is against you. And then you salute your Lord in an act of ruku'. And then you prostrate before the Lord in acknowledging the supremacy and the superiority and the ultimate of your relationship to the Lord, and your rebellion against acknowledging the supremacy of any else. At that moment, you must also remember the prophets and ask yourself, what injustice am I resisting? If you accept injustice and oppression, and your prayer is not an act of resistance, then you're not getting the meaning of prayer. And that is why when I see modern Muslims, and you see them praying while injustice and oppression surrounds them, the paradox between the Uncle Ben clock in Mecca and Mecca itself, the paradox, you're reminded of that paradox powerfully, of the entire paradox of modern Muslim life. But for Muslims who have that consciousness, who are given, and that's why I every time I'm asked to talk about prayer, I put it off, because once people are put on notice as to what is asked of them in salah, then that duty, that consciousness becomes an obligation for the rest of your life. You can no longer deny it. You might have had an excuse through ignorance, but once you're informed of it, khalas, you no longer have the possibility of an excuse. But remember that no prophet prostrated before the Lord except at the same time as an act of resistance against oppression. And when you prostrate, you at the same time, you are affirming a principle. No human being may prostrate physically, in act, or in meaning. If you are completely powerless before hegemonic power, then you are in meaning, as if in a state of sujood, because you're denied free will, you're denied freedom, you're denied your liberty, which is given to you by Allah, by God. And so Now, if you are, the mere fact that you acknowledge your resistance to oppression in the act of sujood might be shuf'a, might be your excuse, even if you're unable to do anything else. So let's say you're living under Saddam, and if you do anything, you're going to be killed. So all you do is you do sujood and tell yourself in sujood that I am in my heart, in my soul, rejecting being submission to anyone else but Allah. Well, that's a shuf'a for you. That could be something that you present to Allah, and Allah says, well, at least your heart was clear, was clean. But if you prostrate before your Lord, and it has no further meaning other than, well, I'm just doing salah and move on, then the spirit, the effect that salah has upon it, that is why, also why, not just from all the prophets, والسلام, to the Prophet Muhammad, that is also why those who were the companions of the Prophet and all the Muslims who truly made an impact upon their environment, check history for yourself. You will find invariably, from figures like Ibn Arabi to Al-Ghazali to Ibn Sab'in to Ibn Tufail, that they were sajjadeen. They were known for their prolonged prostrations before the Lord. Okay, so far so good? Okay. Now, in prayer, we recite. And what we recite is very important. Because everything we recite in prayer has a critical meaning and a direct impact upon the energies that you are invoking throughout the process. So your supplications should start with wudu. If you do it correctly, you should not be talking to anyone else as you're doing wudu. Even I have broken that rule. Astaghfirullah. May Allah forgive me. A lot of us do. But when we start, our prayer really starts at the point of wudu. That substance of life, as you wash yourself, remind yourself, and here I am telling you what the sages have taught for centuries now. Remind yourself that this is the substance of life. Allah has made everything living from water. And make that water cleanse. Remind yourself that it is not just washing your body, but you are symbolically trying to wash away the sins in the same way that washing the feet was a form of baptism, or washing them, pouring head on the water. It's the same dynamic. Then notice how laden with meaning when we start our prayer and we say Allahu Akbar. And the reason we raise our hand is that was the salute, reportedly, the salute of Mediterranean and Near Eastern people from ancient times ago, is that when they would see each other, some of that has survived to the modern age. Till now, you'll find people in the Middle East, they say salam. Salam. Now, if they were go a few centuries back, it would have been a salam. Both hands. It was considered impolite to raise one hand. In modern Middle East, it's just one hand. But if you do it, some places, you still have people say, Assalamu alaikum, they won't go all the way like that, but they'll go like this. It's older, but it goes back, and reportedly, of course, that's the way the Prophet ﷺ was greeted, and that in the Isra wal Mi'raj. Now, if you look at Surah 17 in the Quran, what is Surah 17? Surah 17 is Surah Al-Isra wal-Maraj. When was prayer decreed for Muslims? It was at the Isra wal-Maraj. Very interesting, right? 17 rakahs, Surah 17. You can read a great deal more about the powers of the number 17. But anyway, so Surah 17, chapter 17 in the Quran is the Surah of Isra wal-Mi'raj, and the substance of much of what we do in prayer comes from the Isra wal-Mi'raj and what transpired there. Then we start with Allahu Akbar, God is greatest. The entire dynamic of prayer is the greatness of God. Now, sadly, Hollywood had made a mockery out of that, where, constantly saying Allahu Akbar, and before they blow themselves up. It is an act anchored in beauty. That you are taking the human ego with all its hubris and its propensity to worship itself and elevate itself and to engage in self-idolatry, because a lot of what we do, even when we claim that we are performing acts of Zen, and I watch a lot of these documentaries about cults and cult leaders, especially of the Buddhist variety and so on. It's very interesting because you can see how self-idolatry, if you do not rein in that ego with acts of humility and self-accountability constantly. We were created from the divine. We carry the divine breath. And so in ourselves is the propensity of deities. That is why we engage in self-idolatry, because in ourselves is the propensity of deities. Created from God. With that covenant. Now, interestingly, when we start with the Fatiha, there's a long debate that has been forgotten in the modern age. Many scholars, mostly of Sunni, but the reason that the whole debate about why you put our hands like this is symbolically the affirmation of the covenant between us and God. Some have said no, the symbolic value is in the Allahu Akbar, but in Sunni practice, it is a hand over the hand, and that's why you put the right over the left. It's as if you are tubaya Allah, you are engaging in mubaya, what's
allegiance,
oath and allegiance with Allah. Now, affirming the covenant between you and Allah. And in stand-up, the Fatiha, which is known as Kitab, the mother of the book, notice and review the Fatiha later, but that the Fatiha starts out with a declarations, and I did a tafsir of the Fatiha, please listen to it because it's very detailed and has numerous nuances to it. The Fatiha is in many ways it's a summation of our entire faith in this one surah. But if I take you to a most critical point, notice that we start the Fatiha in declarations of faith, affirmations of faith, with one affirmative prayer. Do you know what it is? Review the Fatiha. What is the one affirmative plea we have with Allah in the Fatiha? Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Guide us the straight path. Before the Fatiha, we're declaring what our relationship, what the truth of our acknowledgement of the truth of what God and God's nature and relationship to creation, then we say, we implore God, our one big imploration. What we implore God to do is to guide us the straight path. And then we describe what this path is. The path of those who have not been led astray and so on. And we end the Fatiha with Amen, Ameen. Amen is a corruption of the Aramaic Amin. Amin is Aramaic, Arabic, and it was Latinized and corrupted in Amen. It'd be funny because if the churches really want to do it the correct way, the way Jesus did it, they should say Amen, not Amen. I would like to see that day come. Anyway. So as you are standing, because ultimately what you will be held to account for in the final day when you stand before your Lord is your relationship and your performance as to the straight path. Now the straight path is everything within the goodness and the husn of Islam, the ihsan, and anything that deviates from the path of ihsan is not a part of the straight path. So when you are asking for that, when you are imploring for that prayer, you are acknowledging that the more God assists you, the more you will excel on the straight path. And God, of course, as we know, says, you take one step towards me, I take 10. And so, and remember that at the points of true test, it's easy for us to talk about it when we're not being tested. And it's easy for us to talk about it when we're not in a state of hardship. Because that's the point. When you're in a hardship, point of hardship, the first thing that starts souring your mood is you don't want to do anything. You don't want to go anywhere. You want to be in a state of inertia, as Grace said. I like inertia in that. You want to be in a state of inaction. But that's not the straight path. The straight path is an affirmative path of ihsan. It's an affirmative path of doing. Read the entire Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The times, a lot of people lived around the Prophet. A lot of people reported about the Prophet ﷺ, from his family and from his companions. Compare the number of times that you see him described as sitting down or laying down, as opposed to the number of times that you read about him on the move. Constantly on the move. Constantly serving, doing something. That's one of the most remarkable things about the Sunnah of the Prophet. And in fact, if you then extend it to a study of the life of the Prophets, is that their prostration propels them into action, not inaction. Then after the Fatiha is at the heart and the core of the position of Qiyam. And if you review my commentary on the Fatiha, you'll understand why. The intimate relationship between the Fatiha and the fact that you will stand before your Lord in the hereafter. Now, in the hereafter, those who are in the light of God, fi nurillah, those who have led a life of accountability, they will be able in the relationship with the divine, they will be able to do ruku' and sujood when they so wish. Those who have not been in the light of the Lord, they will not be able to prostrate before their Lord. They will prostrate, as in some reports, that they will prostrate in hell. But they will not be able to prostrate in it. And that's why we prostrate voluntarily. One of the reasons, I mean, or part of the entire meaning of the symbolism of the act, is that we salute and prostrate because in the hereafter, we want to have that choice, the ability to do it out of love and out of acknowledgement in our relationship to the divine, instead of being those castaways who can only stand and be judged, but their prostration will be meaningless. And so they actually, according to report, that will be frozen until they're judged. It is horrible to stand and be frozen. Think of that. To stand and not have the choice of actually being able to be mobile, to stand frozen, is what defines a zombie in lore, folklore. I don't believe zombies exist. You know, I do believe jinn exist, and there are a lot of things that surround us, not zombies. But it's what it defines a zombie, and it is in our imagination, when we try to imagine what it would be horror, true terror, we imagine that a zombie, something that is unable to be mobile, because it is horrific. So from that qiyam, after the Fatiha, we read a short surah, at least 3 verses of the Quran, and I won't get into what is recommended as to what surahs and which prayer and so on and so forth, but for the interest of time, at least just 3 verses of the Quran is the minimum. Qasar surah could be enough, or, anyway. Then in the ruku', the taslim, the salute that the Prophet is reported, ﷺ, to have given upon entering in Malakut al-A'la, the heavens, is this rak'ah and saying Subhana Rabbiyal Azim. Praise to the Lord the Great. Is that a good translation? Subhana Rabbiyal Azim?
Yeah.
What else?
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, of course, you haven't reached the point of the acknowledgement of ultimate supremacy, because the ultimate supremacy, the acknowledgement of it is a state of consciousness, and it's not simply a physical act. So, and that is why also the ruku', that salute that we perform, a minimum of repeating it 3 times is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And before we do the ruku', and this is the writings of the Sufis on this, is where you can read wonders, you can read, even Ibn Sab'in particularly, I like about this, that before you take the ruku', you take a short breath, and in the short breath, you are breathing life itself. You're remembering the breath of Allah in you. Now, Ibn Sab'in talks about that, how you release the breath as you do the ruku', and in doing it, coordinating, measuring between your breathing and your physical activity. So, Subhana Rabbiyal Azim, Subhana Rabbiyal Azim, Subhana Rabbiyal Azim, and a pause. And then you just stand, the big preparing, the big step before you engage in the ultimate act of prostration. Sama Allahu liman hamida, and you release the breath, and then you breathe in again, and you remember the breath of life itself. Because Allah tells you, فَنَفَخْنَ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِنَا, right? مِنْ رُوحِنَا. So Allah has breathed life into you. And that breath enters into your entire body. It's as if you are breathing in the energy of life. And then you release it as you prepare yourself to detach yourself from physical life. It's your state of being in the physical life in the act of prostration. When you prostrate, you are completely within the sovereignty and the hegemony of God. It's as if you are enter a dimension beyond dimension. Now those who have prostrated, in prostration, you are not just closest to Allah, but you are closest to Allah because you are capable of transcending dimensions of consciousness. What you can experience, all the futur that has come to every sage in Islamic history did not come as they were lying down, but it came to them in sujood. You are closest to Allah in sujood. And that is why also, if you, the closest dua you can make in sujood. If you, but be in a true state of sujood. When you truly supplicate Allah because you truly want something, even from a selfish point of view, because you want something, whatever it is, do it in sujood, but be in a true state of sujood. And as we said, the first sajda is the acknowledgement of the supremacy of Allah, the ultimate supremacy of Allah on this earth, and then the short break in which you take another deep breath, because you're going to go into the sajda thaniya and a sajda al-ukhra, that in which you are acknowledging the same ultimate supremacy, but in the hereafter. You take another deep breath and you prepare yourself, because that second sajda should take you into a greater level of depth with your Lord than the first one. And then you repeat the cycle again. Now, why do we repeat the cycles? Everything in the philosophy of prayer, whether in the way we go around the Kaaba or in the affirmations of the cycles of life, we affirm that Allah has created everything according to a philosophy of energy, if you will, as Ibn Arabi puts it, that everything is created in cyclical form. Everything goes around. And so we affirm cycles of creation as the very essence of the truth of what God has created. And also in affirming that nothing remains. So even us as human beings, we prostrate, but we cannot remain in a state of prostration. We go back and forth between situations of weakness, situations of deep piety of faith, and situations in which that faith falters and weakens. Now, as-salat Ibrahimiyya, because that's very important. The sunnah is that, and there's debate, by the way, about the middle, when we pray 2 rak'ahs, and then we do Salat Ibrahimiyya. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? When we say Tahiyyatullahi wa salawatu wa tayyibat, assalamu alaykum wa nabi wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, assalamu alayna wa ala. So, which the translation of these words are remarkable in themselves. At-tahiyyat, greetings. Remember that you are greeting the Lord. Greetings to at-tahiyyat lillah. Greetings and praise to the Lord, God. Now, the origins of the Salah al-Ibrahimiyya, it is supposed to be, or it was reported to be, and I believe that is accurate, that it is the prayer, the supplication that was repeated in Isra wal Mi'raj. There is, who said التحيات لله والصلوات والطيبات والسلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. So you're giving your salam, peace unto you, the Prophet, peace unto us, peace unto the angels, and then we do the shahada, the testament of faith. So who is saying peace unto you, the Prophet, peace unto us, peace unto the angels? Do you know who's saying it? Who in the Isra wal Mi'raj was reciting that? Huh? There is actually an interesting debate about it, whether it was uttered by the angels. The angels are reciting this, saying, praise to be to the Lord, peace unto you, the Prophet, who is coming to them in Isra wal Mi'raj, peace unto us, وعلى عباد الله الصالحين, and the pious among the followers of Allah, or whether it is recited by the Prophet in greeting the people of the heavens. Anyway, in either case, when you are reciting it, remember now that you are saying, you are saluting God, saluting the Prophet, calling peace unto yourself and unto all. So it is not just, it's a prayer that acknowledges that you are in a relationship with the community of believers and that you are anchored in a basic supplication, a basic desire for creation itself. And what is that desire? What is it that you desire for entire creation? What is it that we Muslims always greet each other with? Peace. Assalamu alaikum. Peace. What is the antithesis of peace? It's corruption on earth. So, and ifsad fil ard. And as Ibn Sab'in says, that whoever understands this, Ibn Sab'in tells us that whoever understands this has understood kunhat al-Islam, the key, the very secret of Islam, the very truth of Islam. We wish peace to each other when we say Assalamu alaikum, but in the prayer itself, our fervent prayer for ourselves and others is that because it is in peace that Allah's creation is preserved, and in ifsad, in corruption, that we steer away from godliness. Then the affirmation of the faith, Ashhadu anna la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammad Rasulullah, which is the essence of everything. Now, I'll skip over the root for Salah Ibrahimiyya itself, the Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallayta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim, which is a dua. It is fundamentally a dua. And a dua that affirms our umbilical relationship to the beginning of the Salah and the beginning of prostration to the time of Muhammad, from the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So when we say Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, Allah so I gave a khutbah about what Salli ala Muhammad and Salli ala Ibrahim means, but basically that bless the Prophet and the family and the followers of the Prophet like the blessings to Ibrahim and the family and the followers of Ibrahim. And wabarak, barak in English it's also translated bless, but barak could also mean give grace to, or grant grace unto. Grant grace unto Muhammad and the followers and the family of Muhammad like you granted grace unto Ibrahim and the family and the followers of Ibrahim. And then one of the interesting debates in the Islamic tradition at the end of prayer, the Sunnis say, we say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Why? Because we are wishing Assalam to everyone on the right and everyone on the left, which is basically everyone. In other words, you are ending the prayer with the basic fervent. Who's that?
I don't know.
I'll stop for a second.
Are we outside?
I'll pause for a second.
Sure.
What time is it?
It's 5:30.
It's the gym.
Yeah.
Is it the gym?
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, they came.
No one outside.
They're trying to disrupt the halaqa. They're being loud.
It is, you know, it's
It should be like half an hour.
Yeah, we have I'm gonna-
I honestly, I
I'm
don't
gonna
know.
check them out. Okay, so
Oh, it's right here.
should I continue?
Yeah, I'm thinking.
Oh, you spilled?
Yeah, it's okay. That's a good sign. No, we're good, don't worry. I honestly have no idea what that sound is. So I think
I've never heard that bell before.
I know, it must be something.
Sound like a doorbell, was it?
It did, but I don't have a,
You don't have a doorbell?
I mean, I think.
We had a doorbell, but this not this
Hold
sounded
on,
new.
I might have one.
Is that it?
Someone like
It's not it.
Yeah.
wanna go inside.
Probably the angels.
So, there are, of course, in the Jafari and Zaydi traditions, the end of Salah is with takbir. And there's an interesting theological debate whether the end of Salah should be an acknowledging, an affirmation of the covenant through the basic relationship of Allahu Akbar, Allah is greater, which is the heart and pulse of humility, a relationship of humility with the Lord. Or the end of Salah should be in the wishing or the supplication of peace to everything that surrounds you. Especially among Ahl al-Hadith and the students of Al-Hadith, they say that the reason you do salam to the right and the left is that you're greeting angels, the angel to the right and the angel to the left. That's not the tradition I follow. Whether the angels are doing their work without your salam. It is creation that needs creatures, Allah's people that, and the rest of creation that needs the supplication of salam. Anyway, a very interesting theological view. But okay, let's, as you can see, in any of these we can speak a great deal more. In other words, in unpacking the Fatha, the Surah, in and when you read Muslim theologians talk about the postures of Qiyam and Ruku' and Sujood, and they go in great detail about why and how particularly these acts affect creation around you, what we call today energy. Uh, uh, what I like to call aura, because it is truly aura. Because what we do physically affects everything around us. It is, we don't exist in a vacuum. In the same way that when we pollute something, it leaves an imprint in our environment. Every spiritual act we do leaves an imprint on our environment. We can go also in great detail about the Salat Ibrahimiyya and precisely what all the Tahiyyat and all the various reports on it. You can because I don't want to give you the false impression that I have given you all there is to give, because that would be quite arrogant, and I have simply introduced you to what is essential to know about the Salah. There is a great deal written about how you can use your breathing, since you're interested in breathing, in aiding your body to enter a state of futuh, so that you can achieve a greater level of fath and ilham in a state of prostration. You can read a great deal about that. But without even reading any of this material, you have enough to whet your appetite so that you can start practicing it. And every prayer, as the Prophet ﷺ taught, that pray each prayer as if it is your last. Salatu wadda. Because if you know that if you're going to be put to death, by the way, people who are going to be executed, unfortunately, in a country like Egypt, the vast majority request that they pray 2 rak'ahs before they die. And imagine if you are doing that prayer before you're put to death. I mean, it's a horrible thought. But imagine how fervently the act of praying would be. And so when the Prophet ﷺ told us that pray each prayer as if it is your last, and remember that in affirming the act of rising and going down and up, you are also symbolically affirming the very true nature of creation. It is as if you are participating. It's like when people go around the Kaaba. At that moment, they are reminded to remember the entire motion of the cosmos in going around the Kaaba, not simply to walk around the block, but in fact to think of the way that the heavens are in constant circular motion as the very secret of divine creation. So in fact you are affirming that in your prayers. And so it is, and if you, to the extent you start out practicing it, you feel that I'm achieving very little, very slowly. But once you start making progress, it's as if it's in the same way like you learn a language. There becomes a point where a barrier breaks, and then your advancements in it is in leaps and bounds, and you don't know how you got there. Suddenly it becomes very easy for you to engage in sujood and enter into completely different realm of consciousness. And in fact, as some of the reports, some of the that report about Hussein radiallahu anhu, that he was praying and flies would come land on his face and he wouldn't wave them away, and then he was asked after prayer, don't they bother you? You're not waving away the flies. And he said, I don't notice, I don't feel flies landing on me. There's another one that's like, I think one of the companions of the Prophet were known for part of the mosque, part of his private mosque, his musalla, fell down from the roof, and he was so deeply in prayer that he didn't notice. There are many stories like that in the Islamic tradition. Now, I've seen that with my teachers that are so deeply in prayer, and alhamdulillah, I've experienced that where you can get to the point where you can literally come into the middle of a carnival and pray and not lose a moment of concentration. You break that barrier, and then it comes to you in leaps and bounds. But and it comes with the grace of God. It is as if you get to that point where God says, "Okay, I'm with you." Alhamdulillah, that's enough with that.
We'll pray and then do Q&A.
Amazing.
We'll be-
Is there
I always, in fact, I always feel at the end of every halaqa, I always feel I have failed because the amount of what is in the brain does not easily translate through the tongue, and then I'm also translating from, I'm thinking in Arabic because I learned it in Arabic, and I'm speaking it in English, which is difficult because
You were
in
brilliant.
language.
Brilliant.
Can we do some Q&A?
Yeah, okay, let's pray Maghrib and then we'll